State Circle is made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you.
Connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Good evening. Welcome to State Circle. Coming up tonight, we will look at what parts of Maryland are literally out of the loop. But with the end of the state legislative session last week, attention has turned to Campaign 2018. Joining us from Annapolis are Melissa Deckman, chair of the Political Science Department at Washington College, and Todd Eberly, associate professor of political science and coordinator of public policy studies at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Professors, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. And to begin, let's start with the marquee race, the race for governor. Popular Republican incumbent facing what's expected to be a big Democratic wave this year. How do you see it?
Well, I think you're exactly right. If this were any other year and if this were any other state, I would say that Larry Hogan was unbeatable. To be the second most popular governor in the state, in the country, and to come from a blue state is saying a lot. But the degree of pushback against Donald Trump, this sense that voters want to send a message to Trump and to Republicans, that could be enough to overwhelm even an overwhelmingly popular governor.
I would say, though, that Larry Hogan has positioned himself about as well as any Republican governor could, especially in a blue state. He has very good political instincts. He's managed to co-opt a lot of issues from the Democratic Party and claim victory for them. The environment. This session, for example, he worked with Democrats to secure and to shore up Obamacare. The thought that a Republican governor would do that in another state is almost unthinkable. So he's pretty well positioned, I think, going into this general election. So I wouldn't count him out at all.
If we look at the Democratic side, you have a wide open race. You have 7 candidates running. There have been a number of polls that sort of divides the 7 into an upper tier and a lower tier. And we expect to see another poll from Goucher in the next week or so. But it's early. Can we really read a lot into the polls that we've seen?
Well, I think we know that undecided is a pretty popular candidate right now on the Democratic side. In fact, undecided is ahead of everybody else. The legislative session has been taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room. I don't think voters have really focused on this race yet. So the fact that we have, say, a top tier of 3 candidates and then roughly 4 other candidates are around single digits, I don't think that means anyone's out of this yet. This is still a wide open race for that nomination.
I agree with Todd. It's completely wide open. There's no heir apparent in this election like there was in 2014. From my perspective, Rushern Baker, Kevin Kamenetz, and Ben Jealous probably have the best chance. But, voters are just getting to know these candidates. A lot of them are frankly unknown across the state. So there's a lot that could happen in the next couple of weeks.
So, Professor Deckman, if you do the math on this, if it's tight and you have a bunch of sort of similarly funded candidates with similar bases, I guess, it's possible somebody could win this with, 25% of the vote.
Or even less if it's tight enough, right? So that would be a pretty remarkable outcome. But, that's the reality of how primaries work. What's also interesting about this race is that the Democratic Party has really stayed out of it, unlike when I think you had in 2014, because everyone came and endorsed Anthony Brown. And I think it was actually not good for him because he ran a very safe campaign. He wasn't willing to take sort of any chances. Whereas I think among this crop, you do have some interesting proposals coming up if you start to look at their websites and what they're proposing for the state of Maryland. So it's going to be a really interesting policy-driven debate among these people running for governor for the Democratic nomination.
And Todd, the role of endorsements here, if we think back to '94, I think, which was the last time there was this big a crowd running in a Democratic primary, it was Paris Glendening who came out of that. And the thing he had going for him was a lot of union support. Does it matter? Does it matter maybe less than it did in the '90s because unions have declined?
Well, if this were a smaller list of candidates, I would say it matters less because unions have declined. But because a candidate could emerge with 20 or 25% of the vote, those union endorsements can be crucial because those are feet on the ground. Those are people going out, knocking on doors, driving vans and picking up people and taking them to the polls. So I think the fact that you see several of these candidates dividing some of that union support, whether it be teachers or service employees, really speaks to them each trying to claim some degree of foot soldier that could go out there and put them over the top. So I don't think I would discount the value of those endorsements at all in this primary campaign.
I would think, if anything, the teachers' union's decision to endorse Ben Jealous was a huge boost for him because teachers turn out to vote. They're one-issue voters. So I think that was a big shot in the arm for someone like Ben Jealous, who isn't really as known across the state and who I think will try to claim the outsider mantle because he's never really held elected office before.
Is there anybody in the second tier that you think might have an outside shot or a larger than outside shot of making a run for it? And if you were advising one of those campaigns, how would you do it?
I think the only one among the second tier that probably has a really good shot is someone like Senator Rich Madaleno. He's extremely well respected in the General Assembly among Democratic progressive groups as well. He has a great track record legislatively. And so I think he would be the one I would see emerging. He's also had a good number of performances in these candidate forums. I still think it's a bit of a long shot, though. He's not well known across the state. He hasn't raised enough money. And if I were a betting person, I would say that one of the three that we mentioned earlier are most likely to be the nominee. Of course, I also predicted that Donald Trump would lose, so I feel like I should get out of the prediction game these days.
Well, that's a pre-qualification that I can't make a prediction either.
If we look at the money equation, you look at the polls, you look at who's got the fundraising. Kamenetz has the most money in the bank. At last report, it was a couple $1 million. I suppose that's enough to do a TV campaign, but it's a little bit difficult when you talk about buying the D.C. market to reach into the areas of the state where he's less well known. It's a very expensive place to advertise.
Well, I think all of the campaigns are really playing into the micro-targeting idea right now. They know that since they don't have to win 50 or 51%, that they can truly play to their base of operations where they're best known, run their numbers up there, and then win respectable numbers elsewhere in the state. And I think that's going to change the funding calculation for a lot of these candidates. Based on the most recent filings, I don't see any candidate here who's suffering for having enough money to at least be competitive in this primary.
I think they're also taking a play out of Governor Hogan's playbook. In 2014, social media really catapulted him to the front of the race. And so I think these candidates are finding more unique micro-targeting ways, as Todd talked about, to reach their base of voters.
When we talk about micro-targeting, is this the sort of work that's done with data that might be lifted legitimately or not out of Facebook? And how do you feel about that as a technique?
Oh, that's a loaded question, isn't it? To be honest, I mean, President Barack Obama first really revolutionized the way that such data were used in reaching out and targeting voters. I mean, what it really means in practicality is trying to make sure that someone might need a ride to the poll that day, right? To try to really coordinate in such a way and to get as many people, as many boots on the ground. I think in some respects, though, we're having this larger debate about the privacy of information. Do people realize that their information is being used by campaigns? Probably not. And I think we're going to have a bigger conversation about this in the future. Nonetheless, I think that most political consultants and campaign professionals have become quite adept at using this kind of technology.
And this is, of course, what all campaigns want to do. They want to identify those voters who are going to be most receptive to their message. One of the criticisms that was levied against Hillary Clinton in 2016, especially in the upper Midwest and Michigan, was that they had done a very poor job of targeting key voters and that they had their people on the ground showing up, knocking on the doors of people who were going to vote for Donald Trump. So she was motivating the wrong people. So to the extent that you can get a hold of this data under the appropriate circumstances and use it to target your key voters, I think we're probably all better served for that.
So if we look at this campaign from the Hogan perspective, running to be reelected as a Republican, which happens very, very rarely in a state like Maryland. The obvious thing is don't accept any invitations to dinner at the White House. Is there anything else he can do to distance himself from a president who polls in Maryland about as badly as I've ever seen anybody poll?
You know, Larry Hogan's already done that. I mean, from the very beginning, he made it clear he would not vote for Donald Trump. He's been very good about distancing himself from Trump as much as he could during the last 2 years. And so I think he's actually already laid the groundwork for this. He's a very smart politician. He realizes that Trump's brand of politics doesn't play well in a state like Maryland. And so I think he's done a pretty decent job already on that front.
And if you look at specific issues, whether it's keeping Maryland in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, the work to save the Affordable Care Act exchanges on the individual market, these are all ways in which Hogan is broadcasting to voters, don't look at me as a Republican, don't look at me as a Democrat, just look at me as the governor of Maryland. And that's what he's got to do if there is a Democratic wave that breaks across the country in November. He's got to make voters have a referendum on Larry Hogan as Larry Hogan, not a referendum on Donald Trump and the Republican governance of the nation.
And he, I think, has a lot of things he can point to. I mean, the state is doing very well economically. He was able to enact many of the things he ran for, right, which is not always the case with a lot of politicians. So he talked about rolling back taxes. And so he's able to really point to a record of legislative accomplishment in many ways. Now, I don't want to say that he's done everything he wanted to do and he didn't necessarily get all that he wanted. He is a Republican having to deal with a General Assembly that is overwhelmingly Democrat. But given the cards and the hands that he was dealt, I think he really did a very good job as governor in lots of ways.
It helps as well that
Well, I was going to say, Todd, to the extent that the governor wants to run as having been an effective manager of state government, does this story that's begun to percolate in the last week or so about a transportation contract that was avoided the normal procurement rules and apparently went to the former employer of the current Hogan transportation secretary, does that story potentially have risk for the governor?
It may, as we see it unfold. It may have more risk for the Secretary of Transportation for failing to fully disclose his relationships, his financial interests, although those interests had been severed prior to this agreement going forward. I think Hogan is protected somewhat by the fact that the Assembly had approved this waiver process to try to move things through more rapidly. And the minute any type of pushback started, Hogan responded by pulling the measure from the Board of Public Works, and they're now looking into it. So again, his instincts for how to deal with this have been right. We just now have to watch over the course of the next week if we learn more about this and if the story grows beyond just maybe a couple of days of coverage.
Any other races that you're paying attention to, either locally or nationally this year?
I'll be paying attention to Mike Miller's reelection campaign. Mike Miller, of course, the president of the Senate, mainly because he has drawn the ire of Peter Franchot. And that's been one of the more interesting stories that has occurred this year in Annapolis. So Peter Franchot, and as well as some progressive unions like the CEIU, which is a union for public employees, has really made it a top priority to defeat Mike Miller. So I'll be interested to see if that has any legs.
And I'm paying attention to what's happening in the 6th Congressional District, the seat that's being vacated by John Delaney. It's one of the few competitive districts in the state of Maryland. If this weren't a heavy Democratic year, it'd be a good chance for a Republican pickup. You've got David Trone out there spending quite a lot of his own money to try to win that nomination. Republican Party has clearly decided that Aruna Miller is the real threat, and they've started trying to push her aside, get people to vote against her before she gets that nomination, because the party realizes it's one of their few bright spots, one of the few areas where Republicans could pick up a seat in the House of Representatives this year.
Any thoughts on the legislative session that ended last week? It seemed, in any election year, you expect some partisan sniping. It seemed muted from this vantage point.
I would completely agree. Again, this was the last opportunity that Democrats had to sort of paint Larry Hogan as a Trump-branded Republican and to really make him look ineffectual, when in fact, once again, Larry Hogan was able to appropriate some of the Democratic Party's main political policies. So I think it was a rather subdued session. I think what was important, for example, was legislation with respect to the Affordable Care Act. Also, that the Assembly was able to pass, and Larry Hogan supporting more gun control measures, which I think is also important, and school safety. I think those are the big takeaways for me from the legislative session.
Yes, so the coverage is all focused on the fact that this has been a relatively successful and very much a bipartisan session, and that absolutely helps Larry Hogan. I think many voters are frustrated by the fact that they look to Washington, D.C. They see that even with one party in control, we can't seem to govern, we can't pass legislation. And here in Maryland, with a Democratic Assembly and a Republican governor, we've presided over 3 months of a very productive legislative session that didn't have that animosity. So that certainly demonstrates to voters in Maryland that, you know, the people in charge seem to have figured out how to make this work, and they can make it work when they want to.
Just a couple seconds left. Well, I'll put you on the spot for a second. Is it too soon to predict a new governor for Maryland? How do you see that race turning out?
I think that it's Larry Hogan's to lose at this point. You know, it's still only April. We have a lot of campaigning to go. I think a lot of it will depend ultimately on who the Democratic nominee will be. Frankly.
We are out of time, so we're going to have to save Todd's guess for your next appearance. Professors Deckman and Everly, great to see you. Thanks so much. State Circle continues in just a moment.
Got an unused vehicle going nowhere? Donate it to the one place that can take you any place. Visit mpt.org/vehicles and support the programs you love on MPT.
The MPT app puts our programs right at your fingertips, so you can choose when to watch, what to watch, wherever you want to watch it. Download it now.
What happens in Japan and Asia matters to me. And with NHK World's newsroom in Tokyo, I get the news live from Japan right at the start of my day.
New ideas come out of Asia all the time. NHK Newsline reports on business, technology, and world events from Tokyo to Bangkok.
Once in the morning gives me a heads up on the competition.
Every hour on the hour, the news I want from Asia.
Watch NHK World now on Comcast Channel 268 and Verizon Channel 480.
Are you turning 70 and a half this year? If so, you generally have to start spending down your retirement account. Even the minimum distribution can place you in a sticky situation. Luckily, you can now use your IRA to make tax-free gifts. Gifts up to $100,000 will never count as income, but always make a difference. That's icing on the cake.
Make your gift for this year before December 31st. Visit mpt.org/support.
This is a box that showed you a world beyond your own. It was just a box, but the world has changed, and so have we. And now the box can be almost any size or shape. And you decide what you want to explore. Anytime, any place. Break out of the box with PBS.
Large sections of Maryland are struggling to keep pace with the digital age. A state task force is looking at how best to get outlying parts of the state connected. We spoke about it with Task Force Chair Charlotte Davis.
It's the Task Force for Rural Broadband, Internet, Wireless, and Cellular Service. So our mission is to look at the gaps in coverage amongst the different technologies and figure out ways to expand broadband networking out through to all the areas to address the digital divide between rural Maryland and urban Maryland.
How big is that divide?
We know that about approximately 300,000 to 500,000 households are not covered right now by any kind of fiber or wired service. 98% of us are covered through cell phones, but that's becoming more difficult to do business on, as well as if you have multiple users in a home. The multiple devices don't often work. Everybody's got gamers, streamers, you know, in the household, and we're finding more demands on that spectrum and that broadband.
It's an economic development issue, too.
Yeah, we know for every mile of broadband build out, it's about a 1% translates into economic development.
So what do you expect the task force to recommend?
This session, we're gonna look at mapping, so identifying clearly where our unserved areas are and how we can expand that spelled out to those areas specifically. So coming up with a dollar figure for what that's going to cost, and then working with local governments to facilitate that expansion.
So it's not just a matter of getting broadband out to Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, Western Maryland. You also have to connect it to somebody if it's going to be a wired connection.
Yeah, you have to have the nodules. The community anchor institutions need to be covered. Right now, most of those are covered. You know, your schools, fire departments, police departments, and then building out from there, building out into the community so that the last mile, the individual households can access, the FCC standard of 25 megabytes per second download.
Yeah, and the other thing is that that's a moving target. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that what was it, 56K modems were terrific.
Yeah, and everybody needs about 300 kilobytes per second to download, to stream Netflix. So that's the standard, but right now that FCC standard, majority of the states not meeting that, particularly on the download piece. So their standard is that 5 meg download, but that's difficult to achieve either through cellular or satellite services. It needs wired service.
Is there a model here either in what other regions have done, or maybe in what the federal government did a long time ago when it came to plain old telephone service?
Yeah, we looked at the rural cooperative services, which is what was the solution back for not only just telecommunications, but electrification. Because this is a problem we've been dealing with for 150 years. Whenever you deal with rural populations and less dense, we need more population to make these pay for themselves. So the traditional solution has been cooperatives. This way, because it's unregulated, we have the Rural Maryland Council, not necessarily task force, we support a public-private partnership model where local government is running the system but paying a private entity to maintain and operate and deliver the service.
All right, so you live in rural Maryland. How do you and your neighbors feel about the services that you have access to?
Well, we all have one, most of us have one competitor that we can use. So I've got no other choice. I got one. I live 2 miles, however, from the fiber optic backbone. The state has built a fiber optic backbone from Oakland all the way to Ocean City. I'm 2 miles from that. I cannot access that service unless I'm willing to pay at least $10,000 to $20,000, as well as get about 10 of my neighbors to also sign up for that service. It costs about $40,000 to $50,000 per square mile to deliver that service.
What's next for the task force?
We're going to resume meeting. We did issue a report last November. We'll continue meeting starting probably next month. We have to issue a report November 30th, hoping to get to some recommendation on how we can facilitate this expansion without regulation, without putting burden on the providers. It's just going to be a challenge.
Very good. Charlotte Davis, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In recent weeks, we have been profiling the Democratic candidates for governor. This week, Yolanda Vasquez speaks to Krish Vignarajah.
For people who may not know you, tell us a little bit more about your upbringing. You were born in Sri Lanka and then raised here in Baltimore City, and proud of it, I might say.
So I was 9 months old when my parents led a civil war and came to America and Maryland. They came with no jobs, $200 in their pockets, and 2 very young kids in their arms. And they built a life here in Maryland that made my life possible. They both became Baltimore City public school teachers. And for me, being the daughter of educators, I realized that it is what Maryland gave us. Every opportunity is what made my life, going from Woodlawn High to the White House, possible. So I served as Michelle Obama's policy director, which was an amazing experience in the sense that she is one of the most passionate, fierce public servants I have ever encountered. And our mandate was to address some of the most critical issues that frankly don't get the attention that they deserve. So 2 of our initiatives were focused on education, making sure that more of our kids get into 2- and 4-year colleges, making sure that our girls get to complete their middle school and high school educations. One of our initiatives, Joining Forces, was about supporting veterans and their families, and perhaps the most popular, Let's Move, was about getting more of our kids to live healthier and more active lifestyles growing up.
What do you see are some of the most pressing issues facing all Marylanders, issues that, if given the opportunity to become governor, you would like to tackle?
I'm the only candidate in the field who's a product of Maryland Public Schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. So I want to see us investing in universal pre-K. providing free community college, addressing the fact that we're underfunding our schools by $2.9 billion. When it comes to the economy, I want us to invest in infrastructure, address the fact that we have the worst commute times in the country, but also want to make sure we provide universal high-speed broadband across the state, that we make sure we create 250,000 jobs in the next 4 years, meaning in my first term as governor, but also address the environment. Recognize that we need to protect the Chesapeake Bay and the tributaries that feed into it, but also invest in clean energy, knowing that Maryland has the highest number of deaths due to air pollution, but also supporting working families. And so I want to make sure that every Marylander has health care, because frankly, health care is a universal right.
This race has not been easy for you. There obviously have been questions about your eligibility to run. That's been resolved. But you are also in a very crowded field with a lot of names that have pretty high recognition. How do you overcome that?
The orthodoxy out there, the conventional wisdom, is that no man can beat Larry Hogan. And my simple answer is, well, I'm no man. And the truth is that at a time when people are looking for new leadership, no one's happy with the status quo. And my point is that if we want to change what has historically been where we are, we need to have new leadership. But I also think what I bring is that unique blend in the sense that I'm an outsider. I'm not a career politician.
That's our program for this week. We're back Monday with Direct Connection for all of us at MPT. Thanks for watching and have a good night.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.